This is The Camp with Zach Heilprin and the Athletics' Jesse Temple.
Yes, welcome into The Camp. I'm Zach Heilprin. That is Jesse Temple from The Athletic. We are now just a few days. We can say days, right, Jesse? Now that it's under 10 days. Well, it's 10 days. 10 days till kickoff. I guess 11 because there's 31 days here in the month of August, unfortunately. So we're days, 11 days away from the Badgers opening up the season against Buffalo. We are excited about that. We got to see a little practice on Saturday. I talked about it a little bit in that episode. We'll hit on a little bit of that, but we're going to run down our depth chart coming out of fall camp. Probably not a ton different than when we entered fall camp, but that's okay. We'll break it down and give you our predictions for perhaps what the first depth chart will look like that we get on Monday when it becomes game week. Before we get started, we appreciate all the support we've gotten here on YouTube. Continue to listen and watch and subscribe here. We also have an Instagram account, the Camp Podcast. Go check that out. And we have our Twitter account as well, Camp Podcast. We're everywhere. Or the Camp WI, I should say, on Twitter. Also, Home Field Apparel sponsors us in part, and we certainly appreciate their support. Check them out at homefieldapparel.com. Best officially licensed college gear that anyone is making. They've got Can't Miss Kickoff. It started on 8/21. They've got some great lines coming, a lot of big name teams coming. I believe Wisconsin's going to be down the line here a little bit, but go check their line out, homefieldapparel.com. All right, Jesse, let's get into this, our depth chart to start it out. And quarterback is one spot that has not changed from when we started fall camp, and really since we started going all the way back to the spring, though I guess Marshall Howe did push himself into that third spot, no longer here, so that's a little bit different. But in terms of fall camp, Tanner Mordecai, Braedyn Locke, Myles Burkett, Nick Evers, and Cole LaCrue.
Yeah, there's been a clear delineation from day one. I don't even think anybody is challenging for any of those roles. Obviously, Tanner handled all the 1 reps. Braedyn handled the majority of the 2 reps, and the only time that he didn't, based on what we saw, is after a couple mistakes where they put Myles Burkett in. Nick Evers is still 4th, and Cole LaCrue is going to be running the scout team. So that's where things stand on that. And I got a question for a mailbag that ran this week about whether Myles Burkett could push for the number 2 and how close he was. And I thought Phil Longo gave a pretty illuminating answer, which in our few conversations we've had with Phil, I think that's the thing that stands out most. He is just as direct with us as he is with the quarterbacks. But what was notable to me is when he was talking about how the things Braedyn is working on, he compared it to, it's one thing to try and fix a mistake in addition class. It's another to do it in trigonometry. They are so far advanced in the things they're working on with Braedyn. And when he was talking about Myles, it was some of the same repetitive mistakes that are on the simpler side of things. If you're going to throw a hitch route, it's got to be in the same spot. So to me, I thought that was a good indicator of why there's such a difference there, but no change in the quarterback room, and it's to be expected based on what we've seen.
Yeah, I think it's worthwhile, and I mentioned it on Saturday. I thought Myles Burkett probably had one of his better days that I've seen. And again, we've seen 9 practices plus the spring, led a touchdown drive during a move the ball period, which was a really impressive. And he had a great throw over the middle, a dart over the middle for about 15 yards. It was a really good throw. And he also finished the drive off with a quarterback keeper, which essentially, I mean, even if they could have tackled the quarterback, he wasn't even close to getting tackled. So I thought that was maybe his best drive of fall camp, and certainly maybe even of spring. It was good. It was good. Not so great for Nick Evers. It was, and I mentioned that again on Saturday. He got 4 plays, and then he got replaced by Myles Burkett. The 4 plays were not good. So if we're talking about clear delineation from Mordecai, Braedyn Locke, Myles Burkett, Nick Evers. I'm trying to get this in the image here. It feels like Myles Burkett's clearly the number 3.
Yeah. I don't think there's any question about it. It's not even close. And another thing Phil said, I mean, you're not going to get on the field unless you know your responsibilities. You can have all the athleticism and talent in the world, but it comes down to what is your knowledge of this playbook, and it's something that Nick continues to work through.
So I don't know if you watched it all. I'm guessing you probably didn't. Big Ten Network was there on Saturday, and they got to talk to the coaches afterwards. And Phil Longo was talking. He was talking about the quarterbacks, and kind of came out of nowhere, but he was talking about a guy in their room that has the most athleticism, the best arm, but there's a mental side of this game as well. And he didn't mention names, but I think we all know who he was referring to. So, yeah, the quarterback spot is pretty clear. We'll do our season predictions next week, but I got asked this question. I thought it's an interesting one, especially coming off me doing my top 10 list of best individual seasons by a quarterback. Russell Wilson threw for roughly 3,100 yards, 33 touchdowns. Does Tanner Mordecai pass those figures?
I am going to be doing a potentially bold season prediction story down the road here before we get to the opener, and that's one I need more time to think about. My initial inclination is no, even though he's going to be throwing way more. He's got a lot more weapons. I need to really break this down in terms of what that would mean per game, but it's going to be hard. Here's the thing: at SMU, look at what he did in those 2 seasons. He had 39 touchdowns the first year. He had 33 last season, and he missed a game last year because he suffered a concussion. So his worst of 2 seasons would have tied the single season touchdown mark at Wisconsin. Obviously, the defenses here are much different, and I think that's my biggest hesitation here, is wondering. I know we've talked about this on numerous occasions, but what is this going to look like? Let's look at that 3-week stretch in October when you've got to play Iowa, Illinois, and Ohio State. That to me is going to determine whether he can break some of those marks. But right now, I'm hesitant to say that he's going to get over those numbers because they're just so mind-boggling to think about for a Wisconsin quarterback.
They are. And then again, I don't know how many games he's going to get to play, right? So Jack Cohn had nearly 2,800 in 2019. He got to play 14 games. If Wisconsin gets to play 14 games,
yeah,
it's hard for me to believe that he wouldn't.
Yeah. And maybe the yardage is more realistic than the touchdowns, because again, I do wonder, like, what happens when they get into goal line type situations? Are they going to look more traditional? You still have a very stout offensive line, Braylon Allen and Chez Mellusi. Those guys need touches. It's hard to say. I wonder how many of those touchdown passes are going to be on some of those swing routes and the things we discussed previously with the running backs. It's all in play. I'm just hesitant right now to declare that Mordecai is going to do it, but stay tuned for the story that I write, because I need a little more time to think about it. I might come around on the idea.
Yeah, so it goes Russell Wilson at 31.75, and then John Stocco at 39.20, which he did in 2005, which again, a season that we overlook at times offensively, but that was Paul Chryst's first year back at Wisconsin, and he had some weapons: Owen Daniels, Brandon Williams, Jonathan Orr, obviously Brian Calhoun. He got to play 13 games. So, I mean, I think it's a possibility. Yeah. I lean towards yes on the yardage. The touchdowns is a little bit more difficult for me.
Yeah.
A little bit more difficult for me. Running back, we know who the top 2 are: Braylon Allen, Chez Mellusi. I thought both of them, especially Braylon, because he was able to take part in everything, had a really good fall camp, and we got to see a little bit of his acceleration at times, which was exciting because we didn't get to see that towards the end of last year where he was battling multiple injuries, and obviously the same thing at the end of 2021. So he's obviously clear 1. Some might put Chez Mellusi 1B. I think maybe Phil Longo would do that. I think they're going to be on the field a lot together. But behind them is kind of where the questions remained going into fall camp. And coming out, at least based on what we saw, feels like Jackson Akers number 3, and then Cade Yakimelli would be 4.
And Longo mentioned it could be a situational deal where you're deciding whether to use Aker or Yakimelli. I think Yakimelli can certainly have a role. He's shown he can be very good as a pass catcher. He's got some power, but I do think Akers gives them the versatility that they're seeking. And it's notable that when Chez was out, Jackson was that 1B to Braylon's 1A. So I think that's where they're going to go. But again, remains to be seen how many opportunities is that guy going to get when you're throwing the ball as much as Wisconsin will and giving the ball to Chez and Braylon.
Yeah, definitely. Nate White, what'd you think of his fall camp?
I thought he really came along, and maybe the reason he got more opportunity in the second week was because of injuries. So if Grover Bortolotti was dealing with an injury, and that's going to elevate some other guys. But when he got his reps with the third group, he showed some of that shiftiness and speed. He had a 40-yard touchdown run. Devin Spalding was very complimentary when we talked to him about Nate White. He liked those qualities and thought he had a really outstanding fall camp. That doesn't mean that he's going to be in the mix at all this season, I don't think. But it gives you a glimpse of the future, and it shows you why Wisconsin recruited him as heavily as it did, and why he was the number one player coming out of this state in the 2023 class.
The only one that Wisconsin offered in the 2023 class. So, yeah, running back will be a lot more interesting in terms of the depth chart next year. Looking forward to that. I know we already got questions about it, but the depth chart next year, I think, will be a lot more in flux and undetermined going into spring, and then obviously going into fall camp, assuming Braylon has the season he wants and is able to, head off to the pros. Wide receiver is doing a depth chart for a wide receiver spot. There's 3 different spots you could do it for, right? But when I think of the top 3 guys, at least in fall camp, I don't know if the depth chart actually comes out this way. Maybe if this is a situation where what I would do based on what I saw as opposed to what they would do. But if it was me, my top 3 would be Chimere Dike, Will Pauling, and Bryson Green, and then fill it in after that.
Right. And the interesting one is Bryson Green and CJ Williams potentially flip-flopping. I know you mentioned during that scrimmage on Saturday that Bryson got a lot of those 1 reps, and maybe even more than CJ. It's hard to deny what Bryson did this fall, and certainly in the practices we didn't have a chance to see, seems like he stood out just as much. The physicality gives him a different dynamic, the ability to win 50-50 balls that, as Braedyn Locke mentioned, they certainly don't feel like 50-50 to him. If it's man coverage, he's open. That is special. That is different. We don't see that a lot at Wisconsin. Quintez Cephas had those characteristics, and I think that's very difficult to keep off the field. At the same time, they do look at those top 6 wide receivers as all starters. But if you're going to go 51-49 or 55-45 in terms of how reps are divided, I think Bryson could ultimately end up in that 1 spot, but they're all going to play. CJ Williams made his share of plays. So if we're going to say that those are the top 3 that you mentioned, then the next 3 would be Keontez Lewis and CJ Williams on the outside, and then Skylar Bell in the slot. But Skylar and Will Pauling are both going to get a ton of opportunities in the slot, because as Longo said, if he loves slot receivers more than anybody other than his wife and kids. So they're going to get a lot of opportunities.
I think the opportunities could also come with them both on the field at the same time.
Skylar it's a possibility on both sides in the slot. It gives you a different dynamic. And we've seen certain situations where they throw a tight end in there. There are just so many opportunities for people to make plays, but it's kind of like when you've got Ches and Braylon on the field, you wonder, it's a pick your poison situation. I think you're right. It could be the same with a Pauling and Bell.
It's also a hell of a 3rd string / 4th string of wide receivers that they have with Quincy Burrows and Vinny Anthony and Tommy McIntosh and Chris Brooks Jr. All of those guys, maybe in other years, would be farther up and make plays. We saw, especially in spring, before he got hurt, Chris Brooks Jr., we saw Tommy McIntosh in the spring make plays. Vinny Anthony got to step up a little bit when Skylar Bell dropped out of practice on Saturday, and he made some plays. So they're deep there. They're very, very deep there. So it's an interesting spot. And I do think we'll get more of those 4 wide receiver sets just based on some of the thinning in the tight end room, and not necessarily having all the guys you'd like to have out there. But that said, the tight end group is really, really hard to determine who's where and what's the pecking order. But if coming out of Saturday, based on injuries and everything else, to me, it's Hayden Rucci and Tucker Ashcraft are your top 2 tight ends. And then just by default, JT Seagreaves and Cole Dakovich.
Right. And Riley Nowakowski dealing with a foot injury. Luke Fickell mentioned it. It's hard because he's not the doctor, but he's giving you what the timeline could be. What did he say? 5 to 6 weeks potentially on that, or 4 to 6.
They don't know.
Right. You don't know. It's not ideal because Riley, when healthy, was pretty consistently in fall camp that we got to see the first tight end up in those reps, and they like his versatility. Rucci, a proven guy, a veteran. I think they've been pretty impressed with his ability as a pass catcher, because he's only got 6 catches for 75 yards and a touchdown, which he had in the bowl game in his entire career. He showed some of that. Tucker Ashcraft, to me, came out of nowhere, and maybe that's not fair, but if you were to go back and look when this 2023 class was put together and all those guys signed, I wouldn't have had Ashcraft in a conversation of guys that you would think would contribute this season. But maybe we should have, once we realized that Jack Eschenbach and Clay Cundiff weren't going to be participating. And that has a lot to do with this. You're getting more opportunities, but he has taken advantage. He's shown that, and as Fickle said, he's got that mix of what Wisconsin had in the past with the physicality and the blocking, but also what Wisconsin's tight end is going to be in the future with his ability to pass catch. So it's been fascinating to watch the tight ends. I still think there's got to be some concern about what you have in that room and the production. I thought it was notable that when Luke was asked about other potential guys moving over there, he did throw in Chris Brooks. And that's a name that has come up on multiple occasions. I'm sure you fielded several questions about this, because I certainly have, because of his body type, because of his ability and athleticism, and the lack of bodies in the tight end room. Could he potentially slide over? Initially, my answer was no, because they'd consistently kept him on the outside at wide receiver. They felt like they liked what they had at tight end, but the more people go down, maybe it is a realistic possibility. I think he could do some serious damage in that role, and it's an opportunity for him to get on the field sooner, because it's just, to me, not really going to happen at wide receiver this season, given the depth, but it's intriguing.
It is intriguing. He got a little bit of run in sets on Saturday where they had him and Tommy McIntosh and Vinny Anthony and Quincy Burrows all on the field at the same time. So again, that's a little bit further down the depth chart. Who knows if that would be something that they would actually end up using on a game day? Probably not. So we'll see. We'll see. It's intriguing though. His body type, and also Tommy McIntosh. It was kind of we were talking about that in the spring a little bit, just because they're so deep there and maybe they don't have enough bodies at tight end that could potentially use those guys. But it sounds like Chris Brooks Jr. would be the guy that they would move just simply because of his size. So,
and we should mention Jack Pugh also, still, based on what we've been told, not participating, dealing with some personal issues or out for personal reasons. And that's another part of this conversation too, because when camp began, the top three, you would have said it's Hayden Rucci and Riley Nowakowski and Jack Pugh. And if two of those guys aren't available, that certainly changes the math on who you're going to put in there. So it's one of the more fascinating positions to watch, because we don't have all the answers right now.
Correct. Offensive line, a group that, again, I think is going to play 7 guys. So the depth chart, how much does it matter? But the first team depth chart, I still feel this way based on what I saw Saturday, based on what we know injury-wise, is going to be Jack Nelson at left tackle, Joe Huber at left guard, Tanner Mordecai at center, Michael Furtney at right guard, and Riley Mallman at right tackle. Now, could Trey Wettig pop up there and be in at left guard? Potentially. Could he also be potentially right guard? Yes, I think there's the possibility. Trey Wettig has got work at left tackle, right tackle, both guard positions. I think center's the only spot he hasn't gotten work at in fall camp at this point.
There's a lot of versatility with that top group, and I do wonder what it will look like if they move Trey Wettig up, because they love Joe Huber. Would Huber slide over to right guard, or would he come out of the lineup and then Michael Furtney would stay at right guard? We know that there was a time where Furtney was running with the twos for a practice or two just to get some other guys reps. The wild card in this whole situation is Jake Renfro, which Fickle addressed after practice on Saturday, that he's been dealing with a foot injury. And much like Riley Nowakowski, there's a timeline there, and you hope he'll be available. What did he say? 4, 5, 6 weeks, something like that?
Well, I mean, he said probably unlikely for week 1. Will we have him back week 2? Will we have him back week 3? We're not sure. We hope so, but we're not sure. Mainly because, Will Pauling got hurt and it could have been like a 3-week thing, and he was back like 3 days later. So like, it depends on how you heal, but this is not the same foot as the one that Jake Renfro hurt in the spring. So it's a different situation, different injury. It's been a little bit of injury bug for him for sure of late.
And he's the one that really changes, to me, the rotation the most, because you know what his position is. He's the center. And if he's healthy, presumably he's the number 1 center. But it's a tough road to hoe, I think, because with him, you mentioned the injury history. He hasn't played in a game since 2021, missed all of last season, got 3 full practices in the spring before he got hurt, missed the rest, and then was trying to work his way back all fall. Basically, all his reps were with the twos. So there's something to be said for continuity with the one group, and his health is something that you got to continue to monitor. So if he's in there, then you got to ask, what does it look like? Because Tanner Bortolini is in the rotation. He's a starter. He's going to play, in my mind, and you've got to move some other pieces around, whether it's Huber over to right guard. Huber's out of the lineup. What do you do with Michael Furtney? What does that mean for Trey Wedig? So to me, that's the one that is going to change things the most. But if you're looking just at week one, I think it's pretty clear what that starting five is going to be.
Yeah. And the second five saw an interesting little development there on Saturday with Nolan Rucci playing a little right tackle, something we have not seen at all. Maybe you keep much better notes than I do, but I don't think we've seen it. Certainly not in fall camp. Don't think we saw it in the spring. I don't think we've ever seen it.
No.
So
yeah,
a little. He got some reps at right tackle that moved Trey Wedig over to left tackle. That's why I referenced him playing left tackle, because he got some work with the second team. I don't know what that means. Maybe it's just trying to give him a little work there. They switched back later in practice, but right now you would have to say that he's the left tackle. Nolan Rucci's the left tackle, right? And Joe Brunner's your left guard. If we're just doing this straight up and trying to use 10 guys, Dylan Barrett would be your backup center, though I think Joe Huber would probably be the second guy in at this point behind Tanner Bortolini. At right guard, it's been JP Benchall, and at right tackle, Trey Wedig or Nolan Rucci.
Yeah, I think there's about three guys there that, and Jack McNeil said that he would be comfortable with anyone in the two deep playing, but there's a reason why there's a 6 or 7 man rotation at this point. I'd be very interested to see Nolan Rucci when he gets to that point that he can compete, given the accolades that he had coming in. It's interesting that they put him at right tackle. Maybe it's just getting him more reps, more opportunities, but if someone goes down, you just never know. There's certainly a lot of talent there to go across the board with all the former 4 and 5-star players. There's reason for intrigue and excitement about the future. But right now, 6 or 7 guys is probably what you're going to see this season, barring injury.
Yep. Let's flip over to the other side of the ball, and we'll start with the defensive line. But I don't know which package to use here. Which package we're going to go with? What will be end up being their base defense in your mind? And base defense by, I mean, which package do they use the most?
Well, I think there will be 2 defensive linemen on the field the majority of the time, and so I feel like that's the way to go about this.
All right, I think it's going to be the dollar package. I do. I think it'll end up being their most prevalent, along with the 2-4-5 or the 4-2-5, whatever you want to call it. But if it's let's just go dollar package. Let's go dollar package for this, for the purposes of this. Is that okay?
Yeah, and what I feel like I saw the most is Rodas Johnson and James Thompson Jr. Now, Isaiah Mullins was, I don't know if he was battling something. Yeah, so
he was out of practice on Saturday.
Yeah, I've been so impressed with James Thompson Jr. and the reps that we've had a chance to see. I know I mentioned it before. He's got that explosiveness, the power, the size to be very disruptive, where in a 3-play sequence, he's breaking into the backfield and making 2 tackles for a loss. Of all the defensive linemen, I think he may be the one in for the biggest leap, but Rodas Johnson has consistently been there. He obviously started last season. I don't know, like when we talk about quarterback, you know who the starter is, you know who's getting all the snaps. It's not that way on the defensive line. So even if we're talking about who the ones are, the twos may play just as many snaps or pretty close to it. So you got to keep that in mind here. But I think the top 4, if healthy, it's those 2, and then Gio Paez and Isaiah Mullins.
Agreed. I think Ben Barton's going to play. I think Darian Varner somewhere figures in here at some point as he gets back up to speed. He was fully cleared and was practicing, obviously, and has been here for a little bit. That, to me, is obviously an intriguing piece because of what he can bring pass rush wise. But yeah, the top 4 feel good. Again, I don't know. Isaiah Mullins is another guy that's been dealing with injuries, and we'll see what exactly it was. The first group on Saturday included Gio Paez and Rodas Johnson, and then James Thompson Jr. was in there as well. But he said he wanted to play 8. He's not going to play 8. Right? I mean, there's just no way that they're going to play 8. They're barely probably going to be able to play 6, just based on how often actual defensive linemen are on the field.
8 does feel like a lot, but all those guys got reps. And the ones we haven't necessarily mentioned, Caden McDonald, Mike Jarvis, like they really went through everybody that they had. But at a certain point, you got to have, I would think, a cutoff of, we know these guys are going to be consistent. We want to get them reps. So it remains to be seen what it looks like, but it's absolutely going to be a pretty consistent rotation where you're going to be relying on 4 or 5 guys at the least to be key contributors.
Hand on the ground outside linebacker CJ Getz.
Yeah.
Who is essentially playing a defensive end role in the dollar package. So I thought CJ had a really good fall camp. He made a really nice play on Saturday in the backfield, has made some TFLs throughout fall camp. Ches Malusi put a ridiculous spin move on him in camp. I wasn't sure if he was going full speed or not, because you're not tackling in that situation, but my goodness, as soon as he got the ball, CJ Getz was on top of him, and Ches made a great spin move to get out of there. But CJ Getz, yes, a great piece to have in this defense. Behind him, I think you could put a couple of different guys.
I think when we've seen 2 outside linebackers on the field, it's going to be CJ Getz and Daryl Peterson, at least to start. But there are a lot of different skill sets, body types, because we've seen 3-4 guys in that role. Jeff Pietrowski certainly can fill that role. He was a defensive end at Michigan State, and 2 seasons ago had 5.5 sacks, which tied for second, I think, on the team. TJ Bowlers is built for that, 270 pounds. So when they're in that dollar look, they've got a variety of options. When they've got 2 outside linebackers on the field, based on what we've seen, I think it'll be CJ and Daryl, and then the next group could be Caden Johnson and Jeff Pietrowski, but TJ Bowlers to me is going to have opportunities as well. So they've got 5 outside linebackers that I think are going to play in some capacity.
Yeah, for sure. Inside linebacker seems really clear. Mumajong Meta appears poised for a big senior year. He was all over the place, club and all, was everywhere on Saturday and making plays. He's a thumper, but he can also run. So he's kind of got the best of both worlds there. And then obviously who starts with him, I don't know that it'll necessarily matter, because I think the other 2 are going to play a ton. But Jordan, right now I'd probably say Jake Chaney he's going to run with the ones, and JT, Jordan Turner, is right there. I don't think there isn't a clear difference between those 2.
Yeah, all 3 of them are basically starters. Mike Tressel's talked about that since the spring. They're going to get the majority of the run. And then you've got Tatum Grass as your 4th guy. I know Brian Sanborn got some reps, but those 3, Muma to me is in for a monster season. We discussed it before, but multiple running backs said he was the most difficult to deal with in pass protection because of how slippery he is, the way he moves his shoulders, the athleticism. He's coming off a year where he had 95 tackles to lead the team. I think those numbers are going to go up. And Jake Chaney, I would say he's a breakout season contender based on the number of snaps that he got last season and what I think he's going to be able to get this year.
Quarterback, same 3 it was in the spring. Throughout fall camp, you've got Ricardo Hallman, Alexander Smith, and then Jason Maitre in the slot. Behind them, I think, is where there might be still some movement, but for the most part, it's been Nazir Forkerine and Jonas Duclona as the outside guys, and Owen Arnett as the slot. I think there's still some movement there that could happen. Max Lofi's going to be back here at some point. Potentially, he could be the slot guy. I know he hasn't played football in a long time, and he didn't take part pretty much in anything here in fall camp. And maybe one of the younger guys pushes Owen Arnett, but I thought Owen had a really good Saturday scrimmage. He's really, really good around the line of scrimmage, which is necessary in a slot corner like that.
Ever since Forkerine took the spot that Jace Arnold had coming out of the spring and moved Arnold to the 3s, I think it's been pretty consistent of what you were going to see out of that top 6. But there are going to be some opportunities. Michael Mack, the transfer from Air Force, I know we're still waiting to see what the situation is going to be with the waiver and whether he can play. He's got that game experience, so maybe he could work his way in there. But I think it's pretty clear what the top 6 is at this point. It was, since we're just talking about what the week 1 depth chart is going to be, Forkerine really came on strong. He showed why he was a Division II All-American. And those top 3, any given practice, one of those guys could be the guy that was making the most plays. And I think that's got to be encouraging if you're a Badgers fan to hear, because you don't want the cornerbacks to be a weak link if the team's going to just pick on somebody. And I don't think that's what Wisconsin has right now.
No, I would agree. Safety, pretty loaded back there, I would say. When you're going, their top 3 are all starters, especially when they're playing in the dollar package with Hunter Wohler and that dollar roll. And then you have obviously Travion Blaylock and Kamoi Latu. All 3 are starters, but I like what they have behind them too, whether it's Austin Brown or Preston Zachman. throw in a couple other guys here too. I think there's a lot of depth there.
It's a damn good top 3 and a really good top 5. We saw Preston Zachman when they go with the reserves. He can take some of those dollar opportunities where they like his versatility. He can move around. Came in as a linebacker. Right. He came in as a linebacker. So, and talked about how in high school he did basically everything. And if you go back and look at his numbers, he had yardage and everything offensively, and basically every position, I think, including quarterback, and defensively did a little bit of everything too. But Austin Brown is that next in line, got power, speed, versatility. So it's really a very talented safety group. And there's a reason why Mike Tressel feels so confident in using that dollar defense, because you're going to move Hunter Wooler up and have him do some of those things near the box. You got to have 2 quality guys on the back end, and they absolutely have it with Braedyn Locke and Latu.
They do. Kicker Nathaniel Vakos and Nate Van Zelst. Nathaniel Vakos told us on Monday, because there were some early issues, and I think he even admitted to that down in Platteville, that one night in Platteville that was not very good. He said he had hit 29 of his last 30 kicks, and he hit all 3 kicks that we saw on Saturday. So he's the guy. But Nate Van Zelst has been pretty impressive too.
Yeah, Nate Van Zelst is kind of a forgotten guy, and he's a walk-on. He's not really in the discussion going into last season, and obviously Vito Calvaruso gets hurt, and Van Zelst put together a really good year. What was he, 11 for 14?
3 for 3 between 40 and 49.
Right, which had been an issue before, and so he's increased his leg strength. Talked about that was something that he worked on this offseason. But they brought Vakos in for a reason. He was outstanding as a freshman at Ohio, and he's here to consistently make kicks. He's got a really strong leg. He talked about how he feels pretty comfortable up to 55 yards, which he made in a game last season. So it's clear the number 1 guy is going to be.
Yeah. Punter, it seems Atticus Bertram's going to be their starting punter, the Aussie Rules lefty. Everyone was looking for one. Now Wisconsin has one. He's going to be the guy. Behind him, Gavin Myers and Jack Van Dyke. But I think it's Atticus's job, and while he doesn't like Fruity Pebbles, or doesn't at least want to try Fruity Pebbles, he does look like a solid punter.
Yes, we learned some interesting nuggets about Atticus by talking to his teammates.
Frappa.
From Australia, they don't have, apparently, Fruity Pebbles down there. I'm not a big Fruity Pebbles fan, by the way. I know that's a side discussion on ranking cereals. I've never been a huge fan of Fruity Pebbles, so I can't really say I blame Atticus for not being too keen on trying it.
But at least try it. It's a cereal. It's not like you're eating like real fruit or anything. I mean, it's just fruit tasting. It's sugar. It's little sugar circles, little things of sugar. That's all it is.
Yeah, it's interesting that the push for this staff to have guys on scholarship on special teams really tells you how much they value it. And much like with Nathaniel Vakos, there's a reason they brought Bertram's here on scholarship. He's the number 1 guy in my mind. He's consistently been the first up in those reps, and I think he's gotten better. And there's something to be said for just being in the intensity in the moment of practice here, because he was out for so long with the back injury. That's why he couldn't go to USC, really couldn't get back into it until the beginning of this year, and was sending film back and forth with the coaches to show that he was ready. And he talked about that intensity that Luke Fickell brings. And I think that's been good for him here in fall camp, that he'll be ready for week 1 to be the guy.
Yeah, I would agree. So long snapper, we got to meet Peter Bowden for the first time. That was nice. One of the more talented long snappers in the country. Seems like a good dude. Doesn't, no one knows his name, and that's probably the best thing about what he does, because if you don't know his name, that means he's doing his job. So he's a long snapper. Kick returner, saw Chimere Dike and Vinny Anthony with the first team this Saturday, and then also saw with punt return Chimere Dike and Will Pauling. Again, not a fan of it, but it looks like that's what the way they're going to go with it. I will say one thing: the kickoff guy, Jack Van Dyke, said that there's not going to be pop-ups. There's not going to be trying to get these guys to take the ball out at the 5 or something like that. It's going to be as many touchbacks as possible, which I think, in my opinion, is good, because I'm always one of those guys that, like, a kickoff return just changes momentum ridiculously if you give them an opportunity. And we saw that last year with Isaac Garendo sometimes. So put it through the end zone all the time, every time you can, personally.
And he's got the leg to do it too. So it makes a lot of sense. It's just easier that way. But he has a place on this team. Van Dyke does. And I think that's a good spot for him.
Yeah, for sure. All right. That was a look at our depth chart. We will get into our season preview coming up here a little bit later this week. We'll also be back on Thursday. Jesse's got a fullback story running on Thursday, which is always exciting for Wisconsin fans to read about. Everyone loves the fullback. I'm a big fullback enthusiast myself. So keep an eye out for that. Jesse, thank you very much.
Thanks, Zach. Talk soon.
All right, there he is. Jesse Temple from The Athletic. You've been listening to The Camp.